Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group, 1-800-BEAT-IRS, BeatIRS.com. That's B-E-A-T, IRS, serving Alaskans, Americans since 1978 with 2 generations of tax defense attorneys. We're honored to have with us again Rachel Alexander. You'll know her as a regular on this program, a senior editor at The Stream, a political columnist, founder of The Intellectual Conservative, and, of course, writes for a whole host of different groups online, Town Hall, Human Events, The Christian Post, Right Wing News, etc. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on the ranch in Oregon. You have an update for us?
Yeah, I mean, what's going on is the protesters are still holding out. They are still, on this wildlife refuge headquarters. They're not leaving. The only problem I have with that is they are trespassing. And so, as we all know, the occupiers get a free pass. They can trespass on, parks overnight when you're not allowed to be there for days on end. Black Lives Matter, they can trespass and they can, burn and loot property, and they get a free pass. And remember, the Baltimore mayor said, we need to give them their space, and she admitted that and even included the burning and looting. These guys are not going to get a free pass. And so it's probably not the best way for them to, protest what's happened to the Hammond ranchers who've had to report back to federal prison, but they are still there. The sons of Clive and Bundy are holding out in this building, this unoccupied building in the middle of this wildlife preserve, and they say they're not going to get out.
All right, let's break this down a little bit. You're saying that they're trespassing. Of course, their perspective is that no, they aren't. That the federal government has actually trespassed on land that they shouldn't be entitled or control of. What say you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes down to this whole underlying issue. I mean, even, these Bundy sons, it goes back to their dad, Clive and Bundy, with his standoff in Nevada, a year or two ago, where basically he said, I'm sick and tired of the federal government taking over all these lands. It now owns 28% of the lands across the country. It owns, I think it's 48% of the land in the western United States, which is ridiculous. This should be private property. Why does the federal government need to own it? And all these controversies have arisen from that. And if you look into everything that's happened with, this Hammond family, it's all related to that. Basically, Teddy Roosevelt made this, wildlife preserve in 1908, to protect animals and all that. And it's just expanded and grown bigger every year. And a lot of these ranchers living around there say that the government has used dubious tactics to take these lands away from them, these lands where they've ranched in their families for many years, and including flooding their properties until they were begging the federal government, okay, yeah, please take our property because our homes are uninhabitable.
Right. They originally came to them. They wanted to buy them out. And then, whether by use of floods, many cases there have been burnings by the federal government that have gotten out of control and that actually burn private holdings. Yeah. And they try to put as much leverage on these guys as they can to sell.
Exactly, and I really want to do a follow-up post on all that stuff. I mean, if I can do FOIA requests and get to the bottom of it, I will. But, in this situation, what finally happened is all this land was finally turned back over to the federal government, which then leases it back to these guys, the Clive and Bundys, the Hammonds, whatever. And they lease this back to them so they can continue to ranch and, cattle graze. Well, so this set burn fire that, the Hammond set on these lands they were leasing from the federal government, which, you go to the federal government now, you get permission to set these controlled fires, to get rid of invasive species, to stop, adjacent forest fires from, burning up all your, feed on your land, things like that. Anyways, basically, that's what they thought they did in these last 2 forest fires that they set. But the federal government came after them really hard. And the truth is, okay, this is the underlying thing between everything. If the federal government hadn't taken over that land and insisted on leasing it back to these guys at higher prices every year, these guys could have set a controlled fire on their own land, and the federal government would have never gotten involved. And if you want me to go on and expound about how I think, this case was prosecuted, I can go on more there.
We've talked a little bit on the show already about Dwight and Stephen Hammond and what happened there, and the fact that the federal judge imposed a sentence that was below, I guess, the requirements of the statute. So the appellate court turned it back to the federal judge and said, look, try again. And this was after Dwight and Stephen were already released. I mean, it's very unfortunate. I mean, they started a fire. There is no evidence that any damage was caused that hurt anything. In fact, the evidence that I've seen is that it actually benefited the land. Fires, I grew up in Kansas and very familiar with farming, ranching. People burn ranch land all the time. It takes care of the weeds, not just the backfire issue, but also makes way for new grass. I mean, it's something that a lot of farmers do on an annual basis. A lot of ranchers do on an annual basis. And this is just persecution. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And then using a terrorism statute, for crying out loud. So these guys are holed up right now in Oregon that are just outraged, not just about what happened to the Hammonds. And by the way, I think it's important to note that the Hammonds have said publicly, and of course some have observed they had to because of the situation they're in, that they aren't supporting or they aren't behind the occupation. But, I mean, the average American that sees this is outraged over it. But these folks are outraged over what they see as an unconstitutional control and possession of land. The Constitution never provided for it. And they're saying, hey, the buck stops here. We're going to actually start a movement that can roll this back. What do you think the likelihood is that they have any success in motivating any real policy change or maybe even a new approach in the courts to how the Constitution's applied with respect to federal lands?
I do think they have a chance. I don't think they're going about it the right way because, they're never going to be held to the same standards as Black Lives Matter and the occupiers. But they have, created awareness about it. And in my opinion, what they need to do is ask for a congressional inquiry. There are few areas where, patriot-loving Americans still have some influence, and it's probably not in the left-leaning judiciary. It's not in the somewhat, still mainly left-leaning media. But we Republicans control Congress. Those of us are Republicans, at this point. And so I would.
But there's some question as to whether that's conservative or not.
Don't even get me started. I was a registered libertarian for so many years because I was so sick of Republicans. But yeah, basically, that's my advice. You go get an inquiry from Congress, and you can get this turned over that way. I just think they're going about it a little bit of the wrong way.
Right.
They're going to allow Obama to come in, and when there's an armed conflict that inevitably happens, Obama's going to call for more gun control.
Well, you look at what's going on out there and how that's set up. And originally, when I heard about this, I started looking at the map and talking to folk that were more in the know with what was going on there. And I thought, what in the world are these guys and gals doing, setting up in kind of a remote area where there's really no access? This is not the type of situation that the Bundys had in Nevada where you could drive down the highway and get to where they were at. This is a little more difficult to get to. So, basically, the feds can keep people out. They can control the media that goes in, and they can basically create the narrative entirely. Without even having a fair third branch of media coming in, the internet folk, they don't get to see except for what's permitted out. So the danger here is that what they're trying to achieve can get twisted in any way that those that control that basically possess that area allow or permit or is part of what their agenda is. And so I thought, well, this is a setup for disaster. Now, since then, of course, Breitbart sent in a crew. It looked like to me they were uninhibited in what they were doing. Maybe you've got a different view of it. Is there a lot of outside press that's focused on what's going on there, or is it pretty controlled who's going in, who's going out?
Yeah, you know how the bias goes with the news media. The majority of the news media is left-leaning. There's a very few, conservatives out there in the media, Fox News, the Stream, things like that. And exactly, does a small minority have the resources to actually send somebody in there? And, will our articles actually appear very high in Google News results? I don't know about you. I'm in the process of, writing an article about search engine bias and stuff. Breitbart is awesome, but are their articles actually going to show up? Are people going to actually read them? Again, like I said before, the Hammonds are fighting, and the protesters as well. They're fighting not only media bias, they're fighting legal system bias, and so for them to like make one little mistake and they trespass, they're not going to get a free pass from the media or the judiciary. And I wish they would change their tactics, but that would be, and the best, the best ultimate option for everybody would be for the protesters to go home. I mean, as much as I believe that, there was so much overreach by the Bureau of Land Management and, the Obama administration obviously controls the Department of Justice prosecutors who are asking for these additional sentences. I don't think they're helping the Hammonds by hanging out with guns saying, we're going to shoot back at cops if cops shoot at us.
Right, and many of those cops probably conservatives on top of it. I mean, the sheriffs out there, of course, are fairly conservative. In any event, we had a guest that came on. I got to wrap it up, but we had a guest that came on yesterday that commented on what these folks need to do is just go home. They've made their point. They've had an impact. They've achieved their aims. They can't get any better than what they've got. And, of course, the question is whether the feds would let them go. That's the real question. Rachel, appreciate the updates as always. That's a very good insight. We'll try to get that up with your story tonight on RestoringLiberty.com. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on.
We'll be right back with you at the Joe Miller Show after these messages.